Welcome to the Deep Shiz podcast. My name is Jeff,
And I'm Eric.
and today we're going to finish our review of the documentary September 11th, A New Pearl Harbor. The last hour number 5. This has been quite the journey here. Last time we ended on talking about squibs. They were like the debris being ejected from the demolition blasts. But then for this 5th hour, they're talking about debris that was ejected even further. They call it ejecta, and it was like an outward explosion. You could see it in like the original kind of newscasts where like the buildings were falling and the explode. Like you could see like debris going everywhere, like really far away from the building.
Yeah, and this isn't just dust that a lot of people saw at the base of the building when the buildings were destroyed, but these are huge portions of the structure, big prefabricated lattices made of very thick steel just being thrown sideways.
And they were thrown far. They were thrown like twice or 3 times the width of the buildings themselves. Large steel beams. And the debunkers said it was just the aluminum, but that was not true. It was the same material as the rest of the building, like steel beams, prefabricated sections, large chunks lodged into surrounding buildings. And this expert calculated the energy necessary to eject this material into other buildings and in that at that distance as well. And it would be the same as launching a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles, which is a lot of energy.
Yes, I think that energy portion of this equation or this evidence will kind of repeat itself a couple times throughout this discussion. But basically, what it's saying is that there had to be some source of energy to throw the objects that heavy sideways. Left on their own, they would fall downward if there were no structure between them and the ground. But something had to throw it sideways. And as they discuss in this section, that's consistent with a controlled demolition because you have so many explosives on all the structural members. Not only are the explosives blowing the sections that are cut sideways, but they're also cutting them so that you need less energy to throw them as far as they were hurled. I think there was an image of World Trade Center 7 with a huge spear of structure just embedded into it. Happened after as the building was collapsing, and just goes to show this was something that was probably maybe 2 or 3 stories tall, and it had crossed the road or the gap between the two buildings and landed right inside the World Trade Center 7.
Yeah, and I guess the question then is the force of collapse enough to do this? And I don't think it would be. Like, I don't think collapsing by itself is going to send all this material, hundreds of meters in all these directions.
Yeah, especially this parts of the structure that were very high up, being thrown sideways. There was nothing to like hit them from above and then kind of squirt them out sideways off of the structure below. And if you look closely, you can see that there's this kind of billowing. It's almost like a pyroclastic flow that you would see in a volcano, where these emerging clouds of debris, and it's very violent, it's very hot, it's and that's kind of what you see in the collapse zone. This kind of gushing forth of super hot material and gases, big portions of structure.
Exactly, and so yeah, it's a hard thing for the average person to really comprehend, like how much force is kind of in the directions of the forces, and what the force of the collapse result in. But yeah, all you have to do is look at other buildings, the collapse of other buildings, like demolitions and everything, and you don't see all this material ejected. Like, of course, they don't blow up like big buildings either. Buildings don't collapse. We'll get into all that later on. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But then they went into supporting columns. They show the science of explosives and how they cause straight cuts. Well, not just the explosives, but like I think they're cut before the explosives with like thermite. So they use this powder that burns at like thousands and thousands of degrees to cut those beams before to create a more, so there's less mangling and it's more of a clear, so you get that pancake effect of each floor falling on top of each other, and so the building doesn't fall over. That's demolition 101. But they found all these cuts that were cut at like 45-degree angles, at diagonal angles, cut diagonally, as well as like V-shaped cuts. And there was this worker who was talking about how he got there and all these cuts, all these straight cuts made, and there wouldn't have been enough time for the workers to make those cuts, nor would there be any reason to make those cuts at those points. This is actually the point that got me interested in this kind of conspiracy theory, because I was just like buying the general theory everyone else is buying, the official story. But then my friend was like, well, yeah, like the steel beams were cut. And in my brain, it clicked. I was like, there's no way that could happen with just collapse, My analogy I use is like, say you walk into a room and there's a piece of bread and it's like cut. You can tell it's cut. It's like, you got two pieces of bread and there's like a really clear line separation between them. You would be like, that's cut bread. But if someone tries to argue, no, I ripped it with my hands, you're like, no, I can tell it's cut. There's just a big difference between the two, if that makes sense. But it's the same way with like the mangled steel beams versus like cleanly cut steel beams.
Yeah, and I think that the testimony of that one witness who was there the day of the attack or the bombing, he says, hey, we were looking for steel workers and acetylene torches to start clearing the material, and it looked like there'd already been a team there doing it for working around the clock. But there was no one there, and he was just alluding to all these cut beams. And just previous to that section, the documentary goes into, okay, when you're doing controlled demolition, you cut all of the beams and columns at an angle so that instead of the load going straight through them, it deflects the beam off to the side. And sure enough, there are all these cuts in different assemblies of trusses and individual trusses and trusses sticking out the ground that are at that angle or in these V shapes. A very inorganic, I guess, shape for something as chaotic as a collapse.
Right. Yeah. So that's like that's a big smoking gun right there. It's like, how would you explain that? Like if the building just collapsed, how would these beams be perfectly straight? You would think they'd have rough edges, like they're ripped apart, or just mangled. I think most of them would just be mangled. How would they be even ripped apart? Most of them probably wouldn't.
And that's a really good point, because if you think of a structure that is all very tied together with bolts and fasteners, it's all interlocked as buildings are, with a huge degree of redundancy. If you would have a catastrophic failure, all the parts would still be connected. But if you were, say, doing a controlled demolition, what you would do is you'd want to break the building into smaller pieces so that it collapses, but also because the cleanup will be much more manageable. And that is what's observed in the wreckage. Also, one item they bring up in this documentary is that the hat truss, which is the structure on the very top of the building, which holds all the columns together at the top, theoretically, had that fallen all the way to the bottom, it would still be intact because there's nothing really on top of it to destroy it. And yet that's totally disintegrated. Where did it go? And
right.
It makes me think. It just makes me think of, like, did anyone, like, in the run up to 9/11, did anyone get like a helicopter photo or from an airplane of anything on the roof, anything that looked weird? Were the charges placed in a visible spot, or maybe they weren't. But however this was done, it was very thorough. All the structure was compromised in a very sequential way, corresponding with free fall gravity. A gravity feet free fall. So there's just the evidence just builds and builds and builds that there was controlled demolition, likely by thermite, and we'll get into some of the questions about heat and things a little later, I think. But this is once again like If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, what is it? I just feel like this thing is quacking and flying like a duck like crazy. Except in this
Exactly.
case, it's
I
controlled
know.
demolition.
Right. And with that hat truss, they did find the antenna, but it was like severely crushed. So I think it would have been damaged because this fell so far, but it wouldn't have been obliterated for sure, and it wouldn't have been crushed as much as the antenna was because it was at the top, so nothing would have fallen on it. It would have fallen on top of everything else. But
Agreed. All I would say that if you were in the business of destroying this building, you would say, "Hey, that's not a structural member, so it doesn't need to be taken out." Because it's added on to the top of the structure. Whereas the hat truss was crucial to the structure staying together, so that had to go. And sure enough, it's gone.
right, yeah, so that makes sense because they had to separate all the columns. And then they went on to high temperatures under the rubble. I mean, this is a big section. Um, so, like, for weeks under the rubble, I mean, weeks and weeks, they found high temperatures, extremely high temperatures, thousands of degrees. Even when there was rains, there was high temperatures remained. They did thermal imaging to kind of see what was down there, and workers' boots were melting. It's pretty insane what was going on with that.
Yeah, they really kind of make it visceral as they talk about going down there, and it looks like you're, looking into these pockets. It looks like an oven, or there's these structural channels, and there's liquid metal flowing down them because it's so hot. And I think there was, temperature readings up to 2,800 degrees, 400, 2,800. And to me, what this says is, once again, this goes along with some sort of a controlled demolition using something like thermite, which is super energy dense. So if you were to set off thermite underground, there's not a lot of areas for that heat to go. So it's just going to stay down there, slowly leaking out into the ground and into the structure above it. But that is an explanation, I think the most likely explanation for those type of temperatures. The documentary goes into how there were cars and a giant fuel tank underneath the building, but a few of the cars,
Yeah, the debunker said that there's always
yes, yeah,
cars and there's gas tanks, and but that doesn't produce 2,800 or even 2,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures.
yes,
Um,
and the fuel tank wasn't combustible.
yeah, the fuel tank wasn't even leaking, and when they went down there, the cars were already burned out. So it's like, well, where's the heat coming from now if the cars were all burned out? And they found a lot of bent steel beams as well. The workers said they had seen nothing like it. There was no cracks in the steel beams, which it means it must have been melting or so hot it was softened, as they said earlier, which doesn't happen with just burning engine fuel. Molten steel was seen underground by workers,
Yeah,
and then the
well,
debunkers.
the horseshoe beam they talk about is something like inch thick steel. I mean, this thing is no joke. It's a extremely robust piece of structure, and it's probably 15, 20 feet long, and it's bent in this horseshoe shape. No cracks in it, which indicates it was very hot when it was bent. And once again, it's like, how do you heat up something that massive to a temperature where it's melted and and pliable? And whatever is going to do that requires a tremendous amount of energy to heat up parts like that. And once again, a building totally rigged with explosives would fit the bill for doing something like that.
Right. So the debunkers, they doubted the existence of molten steel, even though everybody saw it. That was on the work site. A lot of highly credible professionals also saw the molten steel. There's one guy named John Gross who said he visited this site and didn't see anything, but it was obvious that there was melted steel there. And I think he visited this site like way later on. And one guy said the steel beams were like Salvador Dali paintings where everything's melting over everything else. Like, you know, that painting of the melting clocks, and the hands and the arms are all melting, and I don't know if you've ever seen that, but
Oh yeah, very evocative.
very surreal. It's surrealism. But and this molten steel and this heat was around even into winter because 9/11 happened on September 11th, but then they didn't. The heat stayed until like December 17th, so more than 3 months. There was all this heat, and it just took forever to dissipate. And kind of hard to deny that, but they still did. There's even
What's
melted.
interesting too is that the heat signatures of these very high temperatures into the winter were at both towers, 1 and 2, and then also World Trade Center 7, which was only struck by debris and then collapsed. Which just goes to show that whatever happened to towers 1 and 2 also happened to building 7.
Well, Building 7 had fires. There was molten concrete found at the ground level, and there were handguns embedded in the concrete. Um, the debunker said the guns would have melted, but they showed footage of like cooling lava still flowing, but it was cooled on the outside of it, and it was engulfing trees without burning them. So, kind of a similar thing could have happened with the concrete engulfing these guns, just like, and there's these handguns stuck in the molten concrete, and we just keep coming across like, smoking gun after smoking gun here, because molten.
Unintended.
Yeah, I mean all of this.
Molten gun after molten gun.
Yeah, I know. It's like these, molten concrete has an extremely high melting point, maybe even higher than steel, several thousand degrees, and it's similar to lava from volcanoes. And jet fuel doesn't burn at those temperatures, and neither does the collapse of buildings. This is all established science, but they still try to argue that there's something unique about this. There's something unique about the buildings collapsing that caused all this, but do you think it would have happened in other buildings collapsing?
That is interesting you mentioned that, because it's like in a lot of the reporting about 9/11, it talks about how the fires were so hot, the melted concrete, and it kind of to, make the attack seem more exciting and extreme. But of course, the next question is like, oh, that seems really strange. Like, why would the fire burn so hot, especially down in the lobby, where so far away from the airplanes hit? And so it kind of starts to beg the question, but I just don't think the question ever gets asked in kind of polite society. Like, hey, why were those giant fires going on for so long? And, why do we have these like meteorite-looking objects that are like collections of steel and concrete all melted together? Seems odd to me.
I know, right? Yeah, and then they went on to pulverization, which, in regular building collapses, floors stack on top of each other, and things are crushed. But all the concrete, all the office furnishings, and the supplies were almost completely pulverized. One guy said he saw half of like a keypad, but nothing else. So there was like almost nothing left, which doesn't make sense from the forces of a building collapsing. You would think everything would be crushed, but not pulverized. And they're not, those two forces aren't the same thing. Explosive forces pulverize things, not crushing forces or even shearing forces.
A good distinction. I think in one of the in part of the documentary, he mentions how 200 parts of a person were found. So one person had been blown into 200 little pieces, and something like 1,900 people were never found. That all the office equipment, it was just dust and metal. So it just makes me think of this extremely energetic explosions that were occurring on each of the levels as the collapse was being initiated and perpetrated. Each one of those levels, which I'm sure just laden with super high energy explosives, and that just demolished everything. And I think that explains the concrete situation as well. The concrete is kind of the filler between all the rebar and metal. And as the metal gets cut, that concrete's gonna turn to dust as it breaks and crumbles apart. And then you add, of course, all the other material that was inside the buildings, the cabinets, the telephones, the desks, all the people in that being just totally obliterated by these explosions. And I think that's just so telling that as the rescuers were looking through all of the wreckage, they just didn't see anything that looked like what you'd see in an office.
Yeah, one worker said he didn't find a single doorknob, and those are very sturdy, and they couldn't find a single cabinet except for one that was melted. But you'd think there'd be filing cabinets all over the place, crushed filing cabinets, but recognizable. But they were all obliterated. And what kind of force could obliterate a filing cabinet? I don't think a building crushed would have that kind of concentration of energy. Yeah, there's a lot of energy overall, but it's all spread out and it's not concentrated to the size of a filing cabinet enough to obliterate it. But thermite and explosives, that energy would, obliterate doorknobs and filing cabinets. And people, they said, so 2,749 victims. Out of that many victims, you had less than 300 whole bodies found. Hospitals were surprised; they were expecting more bodies. Yeah, there's 200 pieces matched to one person, like you said, and for 41% of the victims, there wasn't even a piece large enough to do a DNA match. So there was like no closure with those families. Like a huge chunk of a large percentage of the victims. And many body parts are found far from the site. The debunkers said, "Oh, that's because of the initial plane crashes from high up," but there were body parts from firefighters, so that was like way after the initial collisions of the airplanes. So, yeah, it's another smoking gun here, and why were these bodies obliterated when? In other similar situations of buildings collapsing, the bodies are crushed but not obliterated. Maybe cut in half, cut in a few pieces, but not 200 pieces, which is more of an explosion. I mean, it just makes common sense. Like when something's exploded, that's when you get like 200 pieces, not if something like if you were to use one of those industrial presses, in those videos of they'll crush just like a tennis ball or something or a bowling ball, and unless something's really brittle, it's not going to explode. And even if it does, maybe like 10 pieces, but not 200. So that's crazy. And that's pretty much the end of the information. Then they go over this conclusion. Well, they go into Building 7 later on, but for the two Twin Towers, they go over a lot of this information one by one and saying, is the data we've shown consistent with collapsing, like a building just collapsing from like a plane hitting it, or is it more consistent with a controlled demolition? So they talked about sagging trusses, the fireproofing, the temperatures causing the sagging of the trusses, and the trusses pulling on the sides of the buildings. Those three situations, it totally looks like a controlled demolition. It doesn't gel with the collapsing theory or the official story. And they went through a lot of different things, like no explanation for the complete collapse, why the rest of the building collapsed, for free fall speeds, explosions, squibs, diagonal and V cuts of steel beams, the ejecta, like large pieces being ejected like hundreds of meters, the molten steel, and the pulverization. All that stuff is more consistent with controlled demolition and not just pure collapsing building. So
Yeah, there's kind of a list they go through, and it's just how do you explain? And it's a summary of all the questions they've asked as far as the Twin Towers go, and what's the most consistent? What explanation explains the evidence? And the case they make is so airtight that it is the controlled demolition that you just have to be kind of like these debunkers and uh, ignore or mislead in order to stick with the official story that was a natural collapse as a result of an airplane strike.
right, and then they go into like Building 7, and there's like small fires, only a few impacts from debris. Looked exactly like a controlled demolition when you look at the video footage of the collapse. The body went first, and even the TV anchors were commenting that it looked like a demolition, or that it was a demolition. And then NIST said It's like a new kind of collapse. They're like, hey, we got a first time in history and only time in history where the thermal expansion caused this collapse. But there were no revisions to how skyscrapers are built. You would think if this was, an actual problem, like if things happened the way they said they happened, would they be like, we got to build skyscrapers differently because if the Twin Towers could fall like this because of a force as large as a plane hitting it, then we better build these buildings differently.
Yeah, I agree. And what's telling about that is that the new World Trade Center, in place of the Twin Towers, is a very similar design with a central core and then beams that extend out to the outside wall. Same design, rough in concept. So, if this is truly a crucial fundamental design problem, that would have gotten rectified. But of course, it's not like there was a huge effort to rewrite all of the building code manuals and make provisions for buildings collapsing due to office furnishing fires. Let's change all of our office furnishings to different materials. That was never done, and I think it kind of speaks for itself.
Makes you wonder if anybody believes the official story really, or if people just don't think about it. Because I mean, you think architects everywhere would be like, "Huh, why aren't we changing what we do?" But everyone's compartmentalized in their own little niche, their own little world.
So I was talking to my dad the other day, and he said sometimes people don't want to know. They kind of suspect something, but they just don't want to know the answer. And the example he gave was Santa Claus. As a kid, you might suspect that Santa Claus isn't real, but you're not going to really ask your parents because you kind of subconsciously know it might embarrass them or you might not get presents. And it's kind of like the innocence goes away. Um, Maybe we have a favorite, uh, you know, uh, deep state analyst or someone who's into like conspiracies, but we might suspect that they're controlled opposition. Or maybe almost afraid to even ask if he's controlled opposition. And I think that same phenomenon is going on in the case of 9/11. It's like, hey, you're an architect, you've got your job. Boy, it seems really weird what went on 9/11, but hey, I'm working on this other project over here. I'm not gonna, you know, that's not my scope of work. It happened 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot of reasons it just doesn't get a lot of traction. People.
Yeah, and the globalists are good at keeping us busy. Everyone's just kind of concerned with relationships and family, providing for family, and could get laid off, they're looking for new work. Things just kind of come up, and everyone's tired because all the sugar in the food, and everybody's just got lots of problems already, and nobody wants to be that guy at a party that's being weird or anything. Um,
Little buzzkill, Jeff.
I know. Um, oh, but there was more with Building 7. Like NIST never published the data or structural model. They had animations that didn't even look like the footage of the collapse. It didn't even resemble it. And Popular Mechanics came out and said the building was built unusually, and even NIST contradicted this. They had the concept of pre-knowledge. The collapse of the building due to the fire is something that never happens. People in these video clips, like firefighters or actually police officers too, could hear the explosions, and they were like, one worker could hear the end of the countdown, like going off somebody's walkie-talkie, I guess a police officer's walkie-talkie, and that officer was telling people to like run, the building's about to blow. So I'm like, how do they know it was about to blow? If it was, what's the countdown from? Maybe, I mean, you could make the argument they knew it was going to collapse because they could sense maybe the internal structure, but how would you ever know how, like, when it was going to
No
collapse
way.
from that? It seems really fishy, and
Well, it's like the debunker's explanation could is possible. It is possible, but is it likely? I mean, what are the chances that there's all this chaos going on and someone happens to do a really quick structural analysis and realize this building is going to come down at exactly this time? It's like, I suppose that is a possibility, but what is more likely when you combine it with all these sounds of explosions, the previous collapses of the buildings, and then a countdown that is exactly similar to one that's done in controlled demolition? Suddenly, which is the best explanation? I think it's obvious.
I don't think it's possible to get it down to like that as accurate as seconds. Maybe you could be like, hey, it's going to happen in the next 15 minutes or something, but not like a countdown. That sounds like counting down to an explosion or set of explosions. But they also talked about the symmetry of the collapse. Building 7 collapsed and Building 7 is longer than the Twin Towers were in shape wise. So if there was asymmetric damage, you think the collapse would be asymmetric, but it was collapsed, symmetrically. And NIST also denied the free fall of the building, but later admitted it fell out of free fall, which, again, just like with the Twin Towers, you can't get that with just a normal collapse from fire.
Yeah, and you have to just look at NIST as they're basically put up to the task of saying, hey, this was a natural occurrence due to fires and airplane crashes. They were that's why they're so unreasonable, so uninterested in looking for the true cause, because they've got this idea that basically they have to deliver the appropriate answer. And the 9/11 Commission was the same way. The conclusions were written before the commission even started their work. So you can tell that like NIST and was not operating in good faith. In fact, it'd be interesting to see there's an Indian fellow who is heading it, and he's giving all the interviews. And I wonder if he, what his background is, and see how he got compromised, or if he was like working for like a government agency. But yeah, you can tell that they're just, they're not really interested in finding the truth. And once again, that just goes to show that there's a cover up going on.
That's the vibe I was getting from when they were interviewing Senator McCain. Someone called into the show he was on like Fox News or something, and he was like, the guy who called in was like asking about thermal expansion and how could it blow up or like collapse from that. And he said, oh, I don't know a lot about this, I'll look it up later. But he wrote the foreword on this book called Debunking 9/11 Myths, and he stated in that foreword, everything begins and ends with the facts. And yet he didn't know anything about that situation. And so that's kind of shady. It made me think, like, what kind of groups is he a part of? Like Bilderberg, or is he part of like the secret societies or not? Maybe he's been told to shut up about this.
Maybe he's been told something, and I think there's some things that John McCain did that were pretty noble. But I think they also know that in order to make an omelet, they've got to break a few eggs. And so I think to maintain their status in their powerful groups they run in, they kind of have to protect the elite, the other elites. So when all the elites are doing this thing, if you're the elite that goes out and says, "Hey, this is all crazy," and I think something is fishy here, you're suddenly going to find yourself not an elite very quickly.
I think yeah, it might not mean exactly that he's part of some groups, but he probably knew something or had some kind of suspicions. But like you were saying earlier, you don't want to upset the apple cart or like turn kind of cause more problems than you need to. And the documentary finally ends with this first responder. It's like a really sad kind of thing because he was like really sick from breathing in asbestos and other toxic things. And he was addressing this whole room, and he said he asked like half the room to stand up, and he's like, this is the proportion of the people, the first responders and the people who live close to the towers. This is the proportion that will die from their illnesses, breathing in all these toxic fumes. And they didn't need to do this, because they were there to help people. I mean, they made all these sacrifices and they paid the ultimate price. That guy who was speaking died in 2010, shortly after
Oh man.
the documentary was finished. And it's just really sad that they were doing a good deed. All those firefighters who died, the building collapsed. Like, they should have been, we can't really tell them, hey, the building's doomed anyway, because that wouldn't have made any sense. That would have screamed conspiracy. But they didn't have to die. That was it's just sad. That was such all these useless deaths. Their lives could have been saved.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I don't think that. I think those, those it kind of reflects the goodness of like of people, and especially these first responders who kind of answered the call of duty. But it condemns the people that perpetrated this crime, and also the enablers who let it happen. Like one of the uh, medical commissioners, this woman, uh, was there on like the first day or second day, or as the cleanup was going on, and saying, "Oh yeah, this is definitely something that hey, these fumes and this dust is not toxic. It's totally okay." And whether or not people believed her, that allowed the work to go forward, which precipitated all these people inhaling poison, and many of them dying. And she was asked later about it. Hey, why did you do this? And she's like, well, my experts said so. It was safe. So once again, she's, you know, uh, kind of hiding behind, hey, I was just relaying what I was told, and no responsibility from her. And I think it just goes to show that that there are people who will take the higher path, and I think these first responders definitely were, many of them and most of them. But then you have these people who, out of ignorance, or not wanting to know, or out of maliciousness, enabled the atrocity, and then the subsequent uh, disaster and health that occurred afterwards. So it is a heavy topic for sure, just thinking about it, and seeing how the people that did some of the best were actually, affected in the worst way, um, with regards to their health, and their lives oftentimes. So yeah, it's a very sobering conclusion to the documentary, and it's just, yeah, that poor guy. He just says like, hey, half of the people who stood up are going to be dead in the next 5 years, and he was probably right, and he was one of them.
Well, he was using it as like an example of the ratio, and he didn't say those people, but he said this is
Oh,
like the ratio of people who were helping versus half of them would likely die from breathing in other asbestos and other toxic chemicals and everything. Um, yeah, it's really sad. It makes me think, am I culpable? Am I maybe there's some things I'm not saying that I should be saying? Um, it might be kind of on a smaller scale, being like these people who didn't blow the whistle, but it's crazy. We've seen so much evidence that this was not the official story at all. This was not done by Islamic terrorists or any terrorists or planes running into buildings. So something else happened for sure. What do you think is, in your mind, what is the most likely explanation if it wasn't the official story? That like I mean, for me, the mens rea, or the incentive and the motive of this crime was money. They didn't want to spend all that money rebuilding the towers, so let's just concoct. And then the government wanted to invade Iraq too, so like, hey, why don't we just do this thing, and it'll give us reason for both of those. We'll fix both of those problems. We can have a war on terror, and we can rebuild these two huge buildings, three buildings, but two of them were the ones that were the most expensive, the two towers. It would cost like billions to rebuild them, or to redo all the asbestos.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say that the Port Authority was the prime initiator of this. Certainly, they benefited. They're the people who owned the building, Larry Silverstein, those guys. Um, but I was thinking about this earlier today, and I think what happened is, within the military, there are contingencies and plans made, and they're kind of put on the shelf, and then they get pulled out when they're needed, or when they're wanted. So I think this was almost certainly like a military operation primarily, and then other people in power um, kind of layered on top of it their needs, and it benefited, the military industrial complex, the U.S. geopolitically, um, the Port Authority and Larry Silverstein, a bunch of people who were in the know, and who sold shorts on the airlines. So it benefited a lot of people, but I think primarily it was a military operation, uh, and it was carried out by elements of the government that were, maybe not general FBI or CIA, but people in those groups who were much more in the know and plugged in, uh, and also foreign intelligence agencies like the Saudis, the Israelis, the Pakistanis. Um, the only way something this sophisticated could have been pulled off was very high level within the government and with the total buy-in and probably the initiative of the military. Sometimes the military seems kind of clueless and inept, but those guys are no joke and they are very powerful. So to me, it's like the particulars, like who planted the explosives. My guess would be in the buildings. My guess would be that was probably foreign intelligence types, because Americans would be reluctant to do that type of direct killing against Americans. The airplanes flying and being appearing to be hijacked. That was all could only be done with some very sophisticated technology and with access to like tanker aircraft and or substitute aircraft, uh, like what may have been used per Operation Northwoods. So, what exactly happened? It's hard to piece exactly who did what, but to me, um, this was all carried out very high level within the government, and other people who weren't in the government necessarily but were very tied in could take advantage and kind of better their positions. If you're Dick Cheney, you're going to get the contract for rebuilding Iraq because you're owning Halliburton, uh, as an example. That's icing on the cake for the operation. So that's kind of my take on it. It was likely decades in the planning, and the people who probably originally planned it were not the ones who pulled it off. They probably dusted it off of they got it out of a folder, blew off the dust, and said, "Hey, we're going to do this as part of improving our geopolitical standing." That's my take on it. Um, what do you think, Jeff?
I think it's probably right. I mean, I don't think anybody. It's got to be the people high up in government. For most people involved, probably didn't know what they were doing. I mean, it's kind of like kind of reminded of like when the Jews would stone somebody back in the time of Jesus or before Jesus. They would. So it's basically everyone would do a little bit of damage, because throwing a stone at somebody is not murder, just one stone. So everyone was doing that much damage just a little bit at a time, and nobody knows who did the last little bit of damage that killed them. And that's basically what happened here. It's just everyone's just doing a little of this, a little bit of that. There had to be a few people who were planning everything, who had just like a lot of power, and just a ton of power. I mean, it seems like Rumsfeld kind of knew what was going on. There's people who are acting suspicious, but who knows how much they knew, or they could have been just told. I mean, Dick Cheney must have known a good amount if he was like, "Don't shoot down the plane."
Yeah.
Like, I mean, why would you do that? It seems like there was a lot of people were just kind of acting out of ignorance, but there was a lot of people that seemed like they're acting out of nefarious kind of desires and that kind of thing. So I don't know. It's
Well,
a mystery there.
if you think of someone like when you think of someone like Rumsfeld or Cheney, they're not people who let others tell them what to do. Those guys seem like pretty hard-nosed, type A personalities, and they were definitely in on what was going on. There's a podcast called Macroaggressions where they talk about the 5 people who were probably running the show on the U.S. side, and it was like Rumsfeld's one of them. There are 2 or 3 other guys I hadn't heard of, and then Kissinger as people who may not have been the ones planting the explosives, but the ones who were kind of like high level running the show. Like, all right, hey, we'll need someone to take the and one of them was a Bush, but not George W. Bush. It was like, hey, we need someone to take care of the media side of things. Okay, we'll let Jeb take care of that. Okay, Rumsfeld can take care of things in the Pentagon, and so can take care of things on the military side. And yeah, these guys, the 5 guys that Charlie Robinson mentions in the podcast, are like people who've operated within the government for like 50 years, and so they know how it works. They know who's talking to who, how things work, and how to compartmentalize things. It's pretty amazing though, like the gumption to pull off something like that is just wild. There's so many moving parts. don't think they could have gotten it wrong though. Like, if one of the buildings didn't collapse, or maybe one of the explosions was so visible, they could have said something like, "Oh, there's a generator in that building, and that's why it exploded in such a way." They would have just modified the story. So in a way, maybe it wasn't super risky, but still, it's so bombastic what they did. It's just kind of, you have to kind of be impressed at the audacity.
Audacity, and also just straight evil, I think. And that's why I think that's kind of why I keep thinking about the secret societies, because it would take a lot of brainwashing and a lot of like just a lot of work to dull someone's conscience to the point where they would be involved in this. I mean, the way like um, Silverstein was talking versus the way the firefighters were talking, like the purely innocent people versus like I'm not sure how much he's involved, or Cheney. And it's like there's a difference the way they were talking about this situation. You could tell that the firefighters were, of course, like innocent, and the first responders were all innocent. Everybody watching was all innocent. Nobody. But then you hear Cheney talking about it and Bush talking about it. And I'm not. It just makes me think who was involved, and how much did everybody know? I think a lot of people in the media must have been. I'm not sure how much in the know they were, but they were at least told, "Hey, mock this idea mercilessly," because there's so much evidence, there's so many smoking guns. We're going to rely on fear to shut people's brains off. I remember watching this cartoon, and it was all about 9/11, and one of the kids was like thinking that it could have been like something other than the terrorists, but then it turned out like he was wrong and everything. And everyone called him stupid, and it was just mocking the audience. Those in the audience who had doubts, basically. A big old psyop.
Yeah.
And that must have happened in a lot of TV shows whenever it was mentioned.
Well, I think O'Reilly interviewed this guy who's a survivor, or his parents died in the towers, and he's just like, "You were disrespecting your parents." And the guy is just like, "Hey, I just want a full investigation. I think there's something else going on here." And O'Reilly is just like, "You are you're sympathizing with the Taliban," and it was just like to say like, "Hey, we don't talk like this. We don't discuss things like this." And I'm sure watchers were like, "Oh, gee, maybe if they're even sympathetic, they're like, man, I don't want to get treated like that." Or, that guy's a crazy person. Look, he's disrespecting all the people who died because he's asking questions. And
You get
yeah,
shamed. You
it's
get
it's
shamed. You get
it.
kicked out of the. There's this whole thing with ostracization. We're hardwired not to like avoid that, like the death. Like it's our instincts to think that if we're ostracized from the tribe, basically, we're going to die. So that's why embarrassment feels so badly, or it makes you feel so bad, because it feels like death, because it's you're flirting with death in a sense from a purely instinctive point of view.
Mhm.
But I saw something similar
Interesting.
with Sean Hannity, and I always liked Sean Hannity, but I didn't like how he was treating this guy who was a 9/11 truther, so to speak. He just was calling him a nut. He was using all these like psychosomatic hand gestures to insult him and to kind of influence the audience, and so it's insane. Cool. Well, thanks for listening to our review of September 11th, uh, a new Pearl Harbor. Check out the official release, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.